We want to bring in GOP Congressman Devin Nunes, ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. Good morning, Congressman. How are you?
I'm doing well. This is my first time on Fox and Friends on the weekend where Ed Henry's not going to be the one interviewing me, but I hear he's doing well, and yes. I want to wish him and his sister the very best. What a great story.
Thank you. He is doing great. We heard from him yesterday. He's eating English muffins with peanut butter and banana on it. So he will be interviewing you soon. But first, we must try and live up to the task and ask you first about the Mueller testimony being pushed back now. We understand possibly on the 24th. What can you tell us?
Well, I think Mueller would be crazy to testify. I don't think it's wise for him to testify. But saying that, I want him to testify. I think there's a lot of questions that he needs to answer. So you already saw this week it got postponed, it was supposed to be Wednesday. Now it's kicked to a week from Wednesday. My guess is it could slip again or not happen at all. We'll see, but we'll be prepared now 10 days from now.
Do you really think we're going to get any more information from him? Because Mueller's come out and said, many times, I've said all I have to say. So it almost sounds like he said his piece. I don't know how much more information there is here that he is going to reveal. What do you think?
Well, I think that's the key point, is what is he going to reveal? So if he's only going to say what he said in the report, there's no real point of him coming to testify. Now, there is plenty of underlying issues in that report that I would expect as an American taxpayer that just spent $35 to $40 million producing what they call it the Mueller report. I call it the Mueller dossier. I think it's an embarrassment. It's an embarrassment that the public spent that much money. If you went to the House Republican report from the Intelligence Committee a year ago, it's a far better and far superior product. And there's so many unanswered questions that I think Mueller has a responsibility to answer.
Representative Nunes, I want to switch gears a little bit. The president is up, yesterday at least, in tweeting about Andrew McCabe. And here's what he writes. Andy McCabe is a major sleazebag among many other things. He took massive amounts of money from crooked Hillary reps for wife's campaign and while Hillary was under investigation by the FBI. And these remarks come after Judicial Watch announced they have filed a lawsuit against the DOJ to obtain records of communications surrounding McCabe and claims he made in his recent book. Do you know what is in those communications? And if so, what is?
I don't know what's in those communications, but the House Intelligence Committee, we asked for those records, we subpoenaed for those records, and we never received those records. So, and then you had McCabe go and write a book. Okay, so we've also asked, well, wait a second, what about all the information when you were writing this book? What process did you go through to write this book? Look, this is a guy who tried to kick me out of a meeting, a Gang of Eight meeting during when this investigation was kicked off way back in May of 2017. So I think he's a bad dude. I think he obstructed a congressional investigation, our investigation, and just on that alone, he ought to be prosecuted for the things he did to ruin our investigation in the House of Representatives, not mention everything else he did.
Congressman, here in New York, there are reports Southern District of New York prosecutors are unlikely to charge members of the Trump organization. What do you know about that? And is it indicative, perhaps, that some of the president's critics will give up their fight against him?
Well, I don't know that they'll ever give up their fight. That's why it's come to the point. I mean, almost every time I come on the shows, when Ed's interviewing me, I mean, I do nothing but almost laugh. But it's so serious and so wrong, it's hard to do that. But this is just another example of they put more bait on the hook and they throw it out. And I'll tell you, when they're bringing Robert Mueller in, they're running out of bait. I mean, they don't have much left. So the conspiracy theorists who talked about collusion, they knew there was never any collusion. Robert Mueller knew the first day that he walked in the door there was no collusion. The lead investigator, Peter Strzok, who's got his own problems, knew there was no collusion. We know that from the text messages. So with all that said, what have we really been looking at? What did Mueller really do? And I want the American people to understand this was not an investigation into collusion or what was happening with the Russians. They weren't trying to figure out what the Russians had done. We already knew what the Russians did. This was nothing more and nothing less than an obstruction of justice trap. Okay? It was not an obstruction of justice investigation. It was a trap that they left open for the better part of 2 years to try to get the president to fire somebody to do something so that they could then move to impeachment. And it never happened because we got a real attorney general and a real grown-up who walked in the door and said, okay, where are the Russians? And, you know, Mueller and his team hadn't seen any Russians except for the Democrats' Russians that they were working with to get the dirt on Trump.
You know, Representative Nunes, speaking of the origin of the investigation and what was the cause, the Christopher Steele saga persists and continues, and you now have former British ambassador to the U.S., Sir Kim Darroch. He vouched for his British spy, ex-Christopher Steele, who put together this you know, unverified dossier on Trump. And he told officials he was absolutely legit. What do you think?
Well, Steele is anything but legit. I think when you actually go through the Steele dossier, people will find in the future that the Steele dossier was probably not written by Christopher Steele himself. It was probably written by Fusion GPS. And the sources, I think, are even more important. I think the sources came from other bad actors. So there's a lot of people in the UK that have a lot to answer for. I mean, they are one of our longest allies and best allies. And hopefully when there's a new government in place over in the UK, some of these questions can be answered. But, you know, you had a guy who hadn't, let's just, you know, specifically on Steele, the dude hadn't been in Moscow for 20 years. Right. He was supposedly relying on second and third-hand reporting from Russians. And like I said just a little bit ago, most of these Russians were either fake or phony Russians or had ties to the Democratic Party.
Quickly, does a deep state extend across the pond?
Well, I don't believe that there's a question mark between was it the British government actually involved in this? Or were they private contractors, firms? Remember, Christopher Steele was a private contractor, and he was probably working with other private contractors like he was working with the Fusion GPS, which was the dirty operations arm for the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party. So those are all questions that still need to be answered is, you know, what did our British allies know and when did they know it?
All right, Congressman, thank you for joining us. We will do our best to get Ed back on this couch to interview you next.
Thank you.